Welcome into Priced Out the Podcast. I'm your host, Cornelius Swart, and Andrew Morgan is off this week. I'm taking his pitch line, and I'm talking to you here from Morristown, New Jersey, in my old stomping grounds in the New York tri-state area. I'm about to flip this over to a conversation with Michael Andersen, who is himself on the road. He is joining me by Skype from Amsterdam. He's an advocate for smart growth, progressive city planning, and he has been a reporter and a friend of mine for many, many years. So we're going to talk this week about zoning. And, wow, we're going to get into an absolute foot fight over zoning. So we're going to try to really walk out here for you folks and just illustrate how land use regulation impacts growth and housing prices. And it can either create affordable housing, or it can make gentrification much, much worse. So we're going to talk about that. All right. Well, I'm very happy to be here with Michael Andersen, who's a senior fellow covering housing and urbanism at Sightlines Institute. That's a progressive think tank whose goal it is to make the Northwest a global model for sustainability, strong communities, a green economy, and a healthy environment. Thanks for coming, Michael.
I'm so glad to be here. That's a excellent summary of Sightlines' work.
Right on.
And I should say I was a big fan of the movie, so I'm honored to be part of helping more people hear about that, hopefully.
Thank you, Michael. Michael and I have known each other for a very long time, at least by the relative standards of Portland. And
That's yeah, right.
he's always been a great journalist, a very smart human being, and has you've pretty much always been reporting on transportation and progressive planning. Maybe not always, but you have a very long track record.
I became obsessed with it, and now I've become more obsessed with it, basically.
So you've agreed to talk about zoning, which is a kind of a dry topic, but I think you make it lively. What
Great.
Can you tell us what zoning is? Why should we be talking about zoning? We're talking about it in Portland here, but we can talk about it just in general terms. In the context of housing?
Zoning is actually not, I think, as scary as it sounds. It just means the government tells you what you can and can't do on a property, right? So if I own a pencil, I'm allowed to snap it in half. If I own a piece of land in a city, I am not allowed to do whatever I want on it. So like owning land is fundamentally different than owning something else because it affects the other people around me, right? So I think that's the basic idea of zoning, and I don't think it's super complicated in that sense. But of course, it gets very complicated, and that's where people get put off is all the different language around zoning. But in the end, it's just saying, here's some stuff you're not allowed to do, or here's some stuff you are allowed to do on your property, and it gets more complicated from there.
Where you can build a commercial building, where you can build a store, and where you can build a house of different densities. And
right. And so that's actually two different issues, and I would separate them. So there's sort of the sort of zoning where they say, this is residential, industrial, commercial, mixed. Like if you played SimCity, you understand those categories. It's obviously more complicated than that, but you can say this is the sort of operation you're allowed to have a business in this building, you're not allowed to have a business in that building is the simplest kind. I think most compellingly, you're not allowed to have a coal plant next to an elementary school, for example. So that's one type of zoning. And then there's another type of zoning that was introduced in the United States. I think it's the first country that started using it, which said, not only are we going to decide type of activity in the building and the size of the building, but then in the 19-teens and 20s, U.S. cities started saying, also going to determine the number of people who can live in a piece of land. So I'll step it back a little bit in context. It's either 1919 or 1917. The Supreme Court says you're not allowed to say people of Asian descent, for example, cannot live in this land, or people descendants from slaves, or people who descended from people who were enslaved, I should say. Whatever. You're not allowed to say who's allowed to live here, And in response, a lot of cities, which were, of course, governed at the time by extremely racist white people, I would say, were, and with great support from a sort of very racist regime in the United States, said, okay, we'll get around that by putting a new kind of law in that says you can only have this many people on this lot. So it doesn't, we're not determining the type of building, we're not determining the use of the building, we're saying basically, essentially, this is how much land that you have to buy to live in this neighborhood, right? Even if you're a renter, you're still paying for the land, right? So they're saying you need to pay for a minimum amount of land per household in this part of town. And the effect of that, of course, is that people who couldn't pay for land as well as their basic home, people who would only be able to afford a small home, but not a bunch of land around it, weren't able to live there. And that was directly targeted at people who had not accumulated wealth. So poor white people, Black Americans, Asian immigrants, children of immigrants of various types.
Wow.
So it accomplished the means of segregation without being written into the law, which is, of course, is what Americans have learned to do so well and are all too familiar with.
Wow. So you're saying, and basically at the heart of it is the creation of the kind of low density single family housing suburb that we have today.
Right.
Yeah,
exactly.
That was a creation of a workaround for the Supreme Court overturning previous segregation laws, basically. Segregation laws around
and I don't want to
who
say
could
that was
live
the
where.
only thing. Exactly. I don't want to say that was the only thing going on.
Sure.
But the Harding administration was explicitly pushing this. They wrote a manual. This is the President Warren Harding in the 1920s wrote a manual. His administration wrote a manual that said, hey, cities, you should do this zoning by unit count thing. And every member of the commission that wrote that manual, or not every member, many of the members were separately quoted as saying, hey, this is going to make it easier to segregate people by race and ethnicity. So this was unstated in the official documents, but very explicit in the political conversation at the time, that was part of the benefit.
Wow.
And I would say, on the other hand, it's not like, and that is not to say that everybody who lives in a single family house is racist, obviously, then or now. It's not to say that it's not nice to live in a house with a backyard. Lots of people would like to have a house with a backyard. The problem is not, backyards are bad. The problem is requiring people to own a backyard to live in an area near people who do own a backyard. That, I think, is bad, or at least in my opinion, we should not be saying you have to be essentially, this tall in terms of wealth to live in a neighborhood, because that is that does a way to keep rich and poor people apart from each other, to keep people of different races and ethnicities apart from each other, to keep poor people and people of different races from accessing the best opportunities, in my opinion.
And it's just an example of how the landscape we all take for granted and that we all just assume was shaped by quote unquote market forces.
Exactly.
Really has a much more complex, much more racially influenced hand. It's not the marketplace. It's really, and it's like you say, the suburbs weren't just built by certain segregationist policies, but as we talk about in the film, as we all know, or many of us know, there were so many redlining policies, or like redlining, that shaped both the inner city ghettos and the post-war suburbs. Were propelled by these both subsidies and regulations, racial regulations. So that's kind of that's sort of the foundations or the beginnings of zoning. But today there's a progressive kind of agenda for zoning, which is to kind of do the opposite of what we see in the single family home dominated metro areas, places that are sprawled, Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, Phoenix, Sunbelt cities, which is to create more dense neighborhoods that are walkable and where you can use transit, right? Then that's pretty much making the neighborhoods a little denser than they currently are, is to kind of promote a level of density.
Right. And I guess I would say, so I also want to separate like growth management from like anti-sprawl policy from zoning. Like it's essentially the same. It's a form of zoning, but like Portland has an urban growth boundary that says only this far out in the suburbs can we put suburban level development. Beyond that, it's farmland, and we keep moving that line as the population grows. But it sort of says it slows things down and it keeps things from leapfrogging each other out into the boonies. So we have to build giant freeways and all that stuff to get in. Um, and that is sort of the way that we stop ourselves from being Houston or Phoenix in that regard. But we've simultaneously, like, if the population is growing, as it is in Houston, in Portland, in Phoenix, only other option is either we continue to jump out and out and out, or we find spaces in the current urban area. And Portland is denser than some cities, but it's not nearly as dense as most like cities of its size in the world. There are a ton of backyards and driveways that we could put houses on if we made it legal. The problem is that in many cases it is illegal to put houses there. And simultaneously, of course, you could also, instead, as well as putting them in between each other, you can sometimes take out a house and put up a bigger building. And of course, that's more controversial when that happens.
And in the recent past, the city's approach has been, like many cities, is to have higher density buildings on the main streets and in like downtown Portland or a city center, and in kind of little nodes, little kind of neighborhood clusters, you might see denser buildings. And that's a policy that's, many cities have pursued over the century.
Right. But yet that's limited because they're so, for example, Northeast Fremont in Portland, it's a pretty significant street. There are a few commercial areas along it. It would make sense for that to look like, or rather, North Mississippi, for example.
Could you give us more specifics for folks who maybe aren't familiar with the neighborhoods or from listening to other cities?
Northeast Fremont, once you get a little further out, runs through a bunch of traditionally pretty well off and pretty white areas and
single family homes,
exactly. And it is not, for the most part, zoned for multifamily housing, and it never has been, even though it's a pretty big street. It's an arterial, or a collector anyway. And North Mississippi Avenue runs through what had been for a while a commercial corridor for black folks in that area, and it was significantly upzoned and was filled with apartment buildings and so on. And the reason that happened, there are probably many reasons, but one of them was certainly that there would have been a lot more rich, empowered people complaining about upzones and changing the situation on Northeast Fremont in the whiter, richer area than there were in the poorer, blacker area. And I don't want to say it's only that. I think there were probably legitimate reasons for somebody in Mississippi to want there to be more bigger buildings there, maybe even, I don't know, there are differences in the two. But that is part of the thing that we see in all these cities is it is much politically easier to say, oh, the change should all happen in these disempowered, disinvested areas rather than in the areas that are already pretty well off and already pretty exclusive. So instead of building a bunch of small houses that wouldn't be cheap but would get cheaper and would certainly be cheaper than the big fancy backyard and driveway houses that are there now, instead of doing that in those areas, instead we're going to force the less empowered areas to deal with the impact of change.
So there's kind of the two sides of the coin there. Like you were saying, in North Mississippi, you have much bigger buildings now, 4, 5, 6-story buildings on that little main commercial street. What was a little one-story commercial area. Now there's big buildings, as opposed to other commercial streets where they're technically still residential.
Right. Yeah, it could be a commercial, but it stayed residential because people there would have been angrier about it, or at least been more empowered, I should say, to stop it.
They would have more NIMBY power to prevent the upzoning.
That's the word I'm trying to avoid using.
Yeah, NIMBY. Let's talk about not in my backyard is what NIMBY means. And so, but the kind of the two sides of the zoning, upzoning, increasing the density of a zone, is that on the one hand, it helps to create neighborhoods where you can have more stores, you can have more
Hmm.
people.
Right.
Theoretically, the housing can be more affordable. People can walk around. They don't need to use their cars or even have cars. So
Right.
that is the good side. On the other side is that creating bigger buildings is almost universally opposed, and rich people oppose it, and even poor people can oppose it. Only rich people just have more power to win the battles.
I
So
would question that a little bit on it. I
go
think
ahead,
that
yeah.
I don't think that there is much evidence that poor people oppose it unless they are also getting priced out, right?
Well, that's what
I
I was
think
going to
that,
get to. Right, right. You got
yeah,
ahead of me. Yes, yeah.
okay, you're right. I think that there is a significant evidence that homeowners tend to, not that this is universal, but I think a lot of homeowners tend to be more opposed to physical changes in their neighborhood, in part because they're not suffering the consequences of the non-physical changes, the displacement, because they own the house, right? Whereas, and I guess I should specify, probably that's more applies to white homeowners. Uh,
Well,
if you remember, but
I'm
go
going to
ahead.
parse. I'm going to parse it out. I would say homeowners in non-dynamic, non-gentrified neighborhoods
Uh-huh.
are opposed to change because they bought the house and because they like the neighborhood the way it is.
That's why they bought
And
it.
right,
Exactly.
and
Right. Totally
homeowners and
reasonable.
renters in gentrifying areas, they buy their houses a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times they buy their
Mm,
house because they want the
good
neighborhood
point.
to change.
Good point. Good
And
point.
and then and many times renters want the neighborhood to change if it's really disinvested.
Right.
Um, but you
Yep.
get to that equilibrium point, or you get to the point, the homeowner's like, well, if you put more buildings in here, I'm not going to be able to park,
Hmm.
or the renters are like, I'm going to get priced out if you put any more people in here.
Right. Which
So,
of course is especially precious if you have a place like Northeast Portland where you had a minority culture that was able to survive as a subculture, right?
exactly. And there's no other
Yeah.
place to go. There's no other minority neighborhoods for one
Right.
to
It's not
move
it's not
to.
going to be the same. Right. Yeah. Um,
So that's the dynamic there. So then we see this battle as far as the gentrification side. We see battles against upzoning, increasing the
mhm.
zoning, coming out of working class communities more and more. There was a battle recently in Queens, in Jackson Heights, I believe, where the community had a developer who wanted to upzone from a 5 story to like a 12 story. It was a
Mm.
pretty big increase in size. I believe they wanted to put a Target in there, and
Hmm.
the the just grassroots organizing, neighbors came in, and they defeated the developer, and the council, the neighborhood council, voted to not only not change the zoning but make it impossible to ever change the zoning in the future. So
Wow.
people really, upzoning is a major flashpoint, all depending on the context, as we've said. But
Right. And let me
go
also
ahead.
bring in something else.
Yeah.
Upzoning is also the only way forward. Somewhere we do need to have more houses, right? But there do need to be more homes because if we don't build any more homes, then the only people who can live there will be the rich people, right? If we There is no way that you can, unless short of building a wall around your city, to use the metaphor of the day, you can't stop people from moving there if they want to, unless they don't have enough money to, right? The rich people who want to move to Portland will always be able to move to Portland. They'll be able to find a way to buy their way into it one way or another. If we don't have enough housing, the people who lose are the people who don't have much money. And it's either going to be somebody who either owns a house or possibly in the future is in a uh, rent stabilized home but needs to move, but doesn't have enough money to move,
Right.
or it's going to be somebody who wants to move there, who lives in, I don't know, Vallejo, California, or Toledo, Ohio, or uh, Medford,
So
and
riddle me this though.
right, yeah,
Riddle me this. Um, and it's been said people will continue to move to a city for as long as it's a nice place to live. And
sure,
you could ruin that with zoning. Some people would say, don't upzone because the reason why people like it in, say, Portland, for example, is because it has these single family neighborhoods right next to
is there
downtown.
really a shortage of single-family neighborhoods in the United States of America?
Well,
Like,
well, I would say they would say in walkable areas, that
Uh-huh.
there are plenty of single family homes out in the sprawl, but
Right.
but so how does building more really create affordable housing? And I'm just going to throw out New York City has been upzoning since, you know, since they bought the island from the Indians, and
No, no, they stopped
it's really
upzoning.
never
They've been
gotten any cheaper,
downzoning.
right?
Something like 80% of the buildings in Manhattan would be illegal to build today. So they're
How do you mean?
the New York. What happened with all these cities that are extremely dense now? For the most part, they were developed before we invented zoning, and that is why they got big. But that didn't mean that once we instituted zoning in the 20s, and New York was one of the very first cities to do it, growth stopped precipitously, and no city. So if you go through the history of the United States, like each city has like a decade where it was like their boom years, right? St. Louis and Minneapolis and Seattle and Portland and so on. And after 1920, after we invented zoning, never again did a city have a boom like we saw
Hmm.
before that, because a city that hit the jackpot economically, like the Bay Area, for example, today, was unable to grow until it could, give that city's wealth to everybody who wanted to take it, right? And
So New York would be even bigger today. The
that's
buildings
what
would
I'm
be
saying.
even
Yes,
taller
right. So
if
like it's not. It's a, sort of like the difference between acceleration and speed. That New York did grow, yes, and that was why it was able to thrive as a city, and why it's the most important city in the country today. But the fact that it grew in the 20s is not what makes it expensive today. The fact that what makes it expensive today is that it stopped being able to grow as fast as it needed to. And so, like, I don't think we should confuse the fact that there is still some building in New York City with the fact that, in general, most of New York, especially outside New York City proper, like all the Connecticut suburbs, just to pick up one example, very large lots, very exclusionary zoning, deliberately designed to keep people who live in New York City from ever making it slightly denser and poorer, or not even poorer, but including poor people. So the suburbs of New York are extremely exclusionary deliberately. New
okay.
York City continues to upzone, but it's part of a larger system, and it still doesn't upzone as fast as it would if it were legal to put more housing in. So anyway, but to go back to your question, I think and this is all my opinion. Feel free to disagree, but to go back to your question, uh, how does allowing more housing keep things affordable? The new houses that are built, unless there is a deliberate government mandate that they be below market, they are not going to be cheap. They're not. They're going to be
Right. Right.
cheaper than a big house on a single lot, but they're not going to be cheap compared to a similarly sized older apartment,
Right.
because it's expensive to build things, right?
And
But
new housing generally goes to maximize profits for the people who build it.
right. Well, in the
So
same way that when anybody sells their house, they try to get the most they can get for it. That's no different, I would say.
and I just
The
want to like
the
stress that
function,
one more time, just
yeah.
so people hear it, is that really, I mean, as far as and you know this more than I do, um, but I see that there's really no sort of, or it's very rare that the free market will create new housing for working class folks. Generally, that's working class new housing is built through subsidies, like the post-war
Right.
suburbs, which were highly subsidized. Um,
Hmm.
and so
Right.
usually free market brand new stuff will go to the highest bidder, and that's
That's
usually
right.
not working class folks.
Right. Agreed. The um, function of most poor people and working class people and middle class people in the United States live in housing that is not either subsidized directly, like it's subsidized by the mortgage deduction, for example, but um, it's not like government voucher housing, and it's also not new. So
Right.
in most cases, the solution is you live in an older house that has a few more cracks in the floorboards, but it doesn't have that new house smell. But it does not that that's bad, but that it's not as fancy, and that's the way we do it. So the function of new housing, assuming it adds more homes to a city, is to give rich people a place that is not the home of a poorer person, right?
Right.
Otherwise, the rich person is coming for the home of a middle class person, the middle class person is coming for the home of the poorer person, and so on down the line, right? And the only way to stop that ladder is to add new housing. It can be the public sector that does that. It can be the private sector that does that. It can be subsidized. It can be not subsidized. It's just you need to stop the ladder of displacement somewhere, or else the rich people are going to win, because that's who gets to move in first.
Now that's a traditional model, like you say. It's like we were just saying. The new housing goes to the richest person, then there's a ladder, a cascading ladder of the housing stock gets older and it gets more
Right.
quote unquote affordable. But
Yeah, well, there are two things going on. There's the immediate question of whether rich people are displacing, and that happens right away. And then there's as a single home gets older, then it gets cheaper. But the reason that it gets cheaper is because we're building new homes, right? If we were building no new homes, like we were doing in San Jose, or actually in, I don't know, outside San Jose, in Mountain View, California, building no new homes, old homes don't get cheaper, they only get more expensive. So the only reason old homes get cheaper is because we're building more new homes.
Okay. And there's a caveat there, obviously, for kind of first wave gentrification, where historic preservation is sort of a newer phenomenon in this older trend of housing, where older homes, if they're in the right location, if they're the right vintage, become attractive.
Sure.
But let's not get off. That's kind of like a side channel.
That's more complicated. But
that's a side channel.
Right.
But
right.
I just want to acknowledge that's out there.
Good call.
So how are the ways that zoning makes, like actual zoning makes housing affordable? So there's inclusionary zoning, there's middle housing, it's all in discussion in Portland right now, and there's sort of ancillary units. Can you explain just real briefly those three categories, and if there's other ways that zoning creates affordability?
Sure. Yeah. A couple different ideas. So there's the inclusionary housing. The idea is that, or inclusionary zoning, a lot of people call it. The idea is, if you are building new homes, then you have to make a certain percentage of them available at below market prices to people who are making below average incomes. So in Portland, the new rule is that 20% of the housing needs to go to people making 80% or less of the median income. Mm-hmm. And because of the way it works, it's really people right around that 80% level, which is like in the 30,000s for a family of three, for example. Or it's not super low income, but it's below market or below average. So inclusionary housing says a certain percentage of newly built homes, even though they're not inherently going to be available to lower middle class people, we're going to say you have to. And in exchange, to make sure that we don't simultaneously shut down new construction because developers are losing money on each of those homes, which of course they would be, we're going to allow some offsets of like you don't have to pay taxes for the first 10 years on those units, and so that'll make up the difference in
and you have to
subsidy.
build a certain number of homes to qualify or to be in that category, right? It's not just like you're building two homes and one has to be affordable. Like you're building 10, 15 units. What is it? The threshold?
I think it's 20 is the threshold.
Okay.
And that's just depends on how you do it. In Portland, it's 20, but it could be 0, it could be anything, right? Just depends on what you want to do. So that's inclusionary housing. And I think the big benefit of inclusionary housing is actually income integration. So like if you have a place that goes super hot and expensive, like the Pearl District in Portland, for example, is this relatively recently built, really fancy, shiny district. It actually has the most below market housing in Portland.
Right.
Much bigger than the biggest affordable housing development in Portland, because it was built with this inclusionary zoning type rule that said there had to be poor people and middle class people here too. And so that's what we have. And it's a really successful neighborhood as a result. So inclusionary zoning is one way. You also talked about middle housing. So this gets into a little bit of technical stuff, but the cheapest housing to build per square foot is attached wood frame housing. So you don't have to set aside land for the driveway. You don't have to set aside land for the space in between homes. You just build homes right next to each other, and that's what you'll see in most of the world.
So not a freestanding single family home,
right?
Just not a freestanding single family.
In most of the world, in a city, a freestanding home is only for a rich person.
Right.
And the way they build middle class and low income homes is you just share the wall, and you can build a wall real nice so you don't have to hear too much through it, but it's much more efficient because it's so much more land efficient. And that could be a duplex, it could be a triplex, it could be sort of two-story apartment building. And not only is this common throughout the world, it's also common in the older parts of U.S. cities. Before we banned that sort of housing, you'll see in most neighborhoods that were built before 1925 or so, those sort of homes were all over the place.
Right.
And that's because we hadn't banned it yet. And those are often providing the cheapest housing in those neighborhoods still because they're older, but also because they're closer together and more land efficient. You don't have to pay for as much dirt.
What makes it middle housing then?
It's a phrase that they've come up with to sort of talk about this, called the missing middle, because it's no longer allowed. But you've got the one extreme is the yard and driveway house, and the other extreme is like the skyscraper, or to a lesser extent the 6-story building on a commercial area.
Mm-hmm.
But there's nothing in between, right? And lots of people, especially I would think lots of people with kids probably, and I don't know, a large array of people would prefer something in between those options. If they don't want to spend the money, or they can't spend the money to have a backyard, nice as though that might be, they might prefer to have a place in a walkable neighborhood that happens to be in a townhouse or a 2-story apartment, a condo building or something.
So like
if
duplexes, triplexes,
yeah,
quads, and townhouses, row houses. This is a building form that is not favored by many zoning maps.
Exactly. So
what
a lot of zoning, and specifically what Portland has done was they sort of didn't leave room for that stuff in almost any parts of the city. The zoning was either like, well, you have to be in a 6-story building or in a house on its own. That's it.
And then the last one is the ancillary unit, or the granny flat, which is the little house, right, the carriage house in the backyard of a single family home that has a garage and a little unit above it, or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that. The classic.
It's sort of a special case of a duplex that, like, it can be attached, it can be detached, but it's a small house is the idea. So in Portland, in Vancouver, BC, just recently in California, they've legalized these as a way to sort of fit small, relatively cheaper homes into especially neighborhoods with big yards, where you can take the garage up to 800 square feet in Portland. You can put a home inside a building on the same lot, and then you've got a little house. And I think that's a almost completely cost-free way to solve that problem of getting enough homes into a city that also has the effect of integrating by income.
And the residential infill strategy, which is a new thing here in Portland, that there's been a big citywide discussion on. People are weighing in, the sky's falling, or this is the salvation of all humankind. Conversation has been happening for a long time, and well, not a long time, but recently, and it's around making duplexes, triplexes, quads, and granny flats easier to build in Portland's single-family neighborhoods, which is the majority. It's like 60% of the city of Portland is like a single-family neighborhood zone.
Right.
What are the upsides and what are the downside arguments that are floating around?
Yeah, and if you look only at residential land, it's more than 80% is single-family. And another thing I should say that this does is it sets a maximum size on new buildings. So it is simultaneously saying you can have more homes on a lot, but you can't have as big of buildings on a lot. So if you were only to say
anti-McMansion,
exactly, it's in both directions, right? So like, if you were only saying you can increase the number of homes on a lot, then that would immediately lead to a fair amount more demolition, I would say. And a lot of people are opposed to that. I don't actually mind it if it were to keep the city more affordable, but that's a different discussion. In any case, what the city is proposing is to simultaneously reduce the number of demolitions and increase the number of housing options by saying we're going to shrink the maximum size of a building, but you can divide a home into 2 homes or on the corner into 3 homes because you have more road-facing doors that way. And as long as it doesn't get above a certain size, that's fine. And I think that is terrific. I don't see a reason why we should continue to say you're only allowed to have X housing units, especially because so many people already are sharing bigger homes in Portland already. It's just that they're only allowed to have one kitchen, and so they all have to share a kitchen. That's sort of annoying, and you get enough people. So it's more efficient, I think, in the long run, especially if you can just let people have more than one housing unit.
And you've written some articles on this.
Whatever thing.
You wrote an article in Medium and another one that we're gonna link to in the show notes. That sort of it's a what's being proposed is sort of the peace treaty between the two factions, which is some people don't want to see little houses knocked down and a McMansion put in place.
Understandable. Yep.
But well, I'm not sure that this is the other side, but what this is going to replace it with is that people are still going to knock down small houses, but they're going to replace them with 2 or 3 units,
which will also have to be small, right?
Each of the new to be smaller.
So instead of replacing one small house with one big house, in which case the only thing you've done is blown $500,000 to replace a middle class family with a rich family, it would be saying we'll replace a small house with 2 small houses or 3 small houses.
And of course, people in neighborhoods, who own houses might be in favor of getting rid of a small house and putting up $1 million house because then their property's worth more. And as a homeowner, it's not likely to go to become a rental unit. So a duplex is more likely to be rented, a triplex even more likely to be rented, and then maybe the renter bias there. But everything in Portland is expensive, so even if it's a renter right now, it's going to be pretty well off folks.
And in the long run, it's also going to increase the things about Portland I think people do love about Portland, which is that there is walkable retail nearby. That's because the reason we have that in the older neighborhoods is because the older neighborhoods had these duplexes and triplexes, right? There are enough families, enough wallets within walking distance to support a corner shop. There are enough transit riders to support a frequent bus, and that's why the buses can be frequent in the older neighborhoods. Whereas if you get out into the post-war neighborhoods in East Portland, for example, buses are not as good. You have to walk a long way to get to a grocery store, and that's in part because we made it illegal to live closely enough to support walkable retail and walkable transit. So it's not really, I think, in the long run even in the short run, going to decrease the desirability of anybody's home, honestly. I think people are always worried about changes. I think the pretty consistent trend is that if you have more people in a neighborhood, its value of land in that neighborhood goes up. And actually, that is why it's so important to let the land be shared among more and more families, because when the value of the land goes up, the only way to keep it affordable is by splitting up the cost that the family needs to bear for a piece of that land.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've written an article that says your own personal recommendations for what you think the strategy doesn't have. Can you just highlight those things real quick and tell us why you think these changes should be made?
Sure, I'll try to do it quickly. I think that part of the problem of the current proposal is that it'll still result in 1-for-1 demolitions. It'll still replace a small house with a medium-sized house more often than not. I think it should be what we would rather have is to replace a small house with a duplex or a triplex. And the way to do that is to let the duplex or triplex be a little bit bigger. So like to add another 500 square feet or so, for example, not a huge amount more, but like the more more homes that a single building contains, the bigger it should be allowed to be. That's the way to incentivize these small, slightly denser developments. Similarly, it's important to integrate below market housing into these nicer neighborhoods for the reasons we've discussed. So I think that building should be allowed to be a little bit bigger if it includes a cheaper home, basically. There are ways to structure that, but that's the basic idea. And the goal there is to make it equally profitable for somebody to include a inclusionary unit as a non-inclusionary unit. And if you do that, then you get a bunch of inclusionary units, which is great. And the only thing you need to do there, you don't even need to write a check from the taxpayers. You just need to say, yeah, this home can be a little bit bigger. Third, I would say you don't want to include mandatory parking on any lot in the city. It's fine for people to put parking in if they want to, but we shouldn't say you have to put in parking if you would rather live in a place without parking on site, because there's nowhere in the city that parking is more important than housing. And fourth, I think we need to be letting everywhere in the city, like I mentioned, East Portland doesn't have enough walkable retail, doesn't have enough walkable transit because it's been illegal to put in smaller, denser housing there for so long. I think with the current proposal, excludes East Portland. And I think it's important to have anti-gentrification, anti-displacement provisions in there. Like we should say, for example, you have to include one inclusionary unit on site in parts of the city. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean we're not helping anything by just preventing duplexes, because what we're still going to get that small homes replaced by medium-sized homes, one for one, which doesn't get us anything good.
I think those are all good points. And I think to wrap it up, do you have like a kind of a something else that people should think about when they're thinking about zoning and gentrification?
I think you put it really well, that we've never had a free market in housing. It's been a significantly less free market since we put in zoning. The problem, I think, with American housing is that it's only half regulated. We've regulated the supply, but we haven't regulated the price, right? So we could solve that either by regulating the price and then simultaneously making sure that we get enough supply, or we could take some of the constraints off the supply and then we can regulate the price to some extent if we want to, or we could not. But like a big part of the problem will be solved by the fact that we are only regulating the half of it that helps rich people. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that will make sense to folks. And I would just add that, when it comes to zoning and gentrifying communities, and there's an up zone or a change in zone, the devil is in the details.
That's also true.
If it's
Definitely agree.
Zoning can serve two ends, and if you are a homeowner in a largely homeowner-dominated area and they want to upzone, it might actually help make your neighborhood more affordable to other people who can't afford to stay there or live there. It could be the opposite. If you're in a poor renter area and they do a massive upzone, then that upzone means that new, wealthier people are going to come in to those buildings, like say 4th Avenue and Park Slope, where they rezoned it and it just a bunch of wealthy condos went in. That means your neighborhood's going to get more expensive unless there's some kind of clawbacks for the community, like inclusionary zoning or some other community benefits agreement. So you got to be very careful, got to watch out. And Michael, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Hopefully I'll have you back.
Great. Good. Have fun. Talk to you later.
All right. If Andrew was here, he would say that was a great conversation, a really, really interesting interview, and I would totally agree with him. Hopefully we'll have him back here for our next show, which will be a conversation about gentrification and what I sometimes call ghettoization, but definitely housing discrimination that's going on in St. Louis and East St. Louis. We'll be talking with some cool folks from St. Louis who, at least a few of them I met when I was there a couple of months ago with the St. Louis International Film Festival. So please subscribe to our show on iTunes and on YouTube, and follow us on social media, Facebook and Twitter. Thanks very much, and we'll talk to you again.